Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are wrestling with a question that it really changes the entire architecture of faith for billions of people.
It really does.
This isn't just some academic theological debate. This is, I think, the highest stakes intellectual question when it comes to sovereignty. Where does legislative authority truly reside?
It's such a profound inquiry. It forces you, the listener, to really confront your inherited assumptions about divine law, about where the rules actually come from.
Right.
So our mission for you today is to move beyond, let's say, the comfort of tradition and to build a rigorous, coherent, and philosophical understanding of that very famous command: obey Allah and obey the messenger.
Yeah, and for centuries, the common understanding has been that, well, the messenger provided law from two distinct sources. You had the direct revelation, the Quran, and then his independent practice and rulings, the Sunnah.
Two separate tracks, essentially.
Exactly. But our deep dive today, where we're extracting insights from core Quranic verses, we're looking at 599, 6.19, and of course the pivotal 4.59 explores a completely different framework.
A framework where the Quran stands as the singular, self-sufficient source of all divine law.
So the core thesis we're going to build the rational scaffolding for is this: obedience to the messenger is intrinsically and shine, and exclusively obedience to the Quranic revelation.
That's it, the one he was tasked to deliver and embody. The two obligations, obeying Allah and obeying the messenger, they become unified.
Why?
Because the messenger's actions were just the perfect reflection of Allah's singular law. It's not a second source, it's a mirror of the first.
So we're going to start with the foundational principles. We have to establish the explicit job description the Quran gives to the prophet, and then from there we can look at the legal and ethical architecture the Quran establishes for the entire community.
Okay, so let's unpack that foundational concept first. The very identity of the messenger, according to the revelation itself, we have to establish this principle that the prophet's authority derives entirely from the message, not from an independent ability to legislate. Why is starting there so crucial?
Well, because if we misidentify the role of the primary human figure in the whole narrative, the entire structure of the faith, it just becomes destabilized.
Right, the foundation is cracked.
Completely.
Yeah.
If the messenger is allowed to be a co-legislator, then the law becomes contingent on his personal actions, his cultural context, the imperfections that are just inherent in human memory and transmission over centuries.
So the starting point has to be what the text itself says his role is. It has to be the role description provided by the divine text itself, because that's what sets the hard limits on human authority in the realm of law.
And the Quran establishes this limit with, its powerful, unambiguous language. We're in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 5, verse 99. It states, "The messenger's duty is only to deliver the message."
And that word, only, is the boundary marker. It's the entire function. It's a severe restriction, and you have to feel it's designed to protect the purity of the source.
It's not just a casual word choice.
Not at all. The prophet is defined here as a conveyor, a courier, a messenger, not an originator, not an editor, not a co-legislator. If his duty were to convey the Quran and independently legislate supplemental law, the verse would have said so.
Of course.
The singularity of the duty guarantees the singularity of the source.
Okay, but this raises a necessary challenge that we have to address right away. For 1400 years, the majority of the Muslim world has insisted that the prophet did provide independent legislative rulings, and that these form a crucial second source of law, the Sunnah. If that's the case, how do we reconcile that vast body of material with the unambiguous word only in 5.99?
And that is the pivotal intellectual tension, is the very thing this deep dive seeks to resolve. And the resolution, really, it lies in the fact that the messenger's life wasn't a separate book of law, but the perfect mirror of the first book.
So not a new source, but a reflection.
Exactly. The Quran is self-referential. It claims to be complete. The messenger's only legal obligation, which he fulfilled perfectly, was to implement what was revealed. Therefore, following his implementation is, by necessity, following the divine instruction.
I see. If we grant him an independent legislative role, we immediately run into a huge theological conflict with the second half of that very same verse.
Tell us about that latter half.
So the verse continues, "And Allah knows whatever you reveal and whatever you conceal."
This comprehensive knowledge of Allah is the ultimate guarantor. It's the insurance policy on the message's purity and its sufficiency. It fundamentally underscores that no part of the message, no detail, no nuance, could be altered or concealed or added to by the messenger.
Because God would know.
Because God already knows everything.
Oh.
If he were tasked to legislate independently, outside the explicit bounds of the revelation, that would introduce a potential source of human fallibility. The very thing Allah's omniscience explicitly guards against. The fact that Allah knows everything eliminates the possibility of any necessary unrevealed law.
That idea of purity, that every single detail must be intact, that's where the high stakes come in. Because if you allow for any human addition, you spoil the whole batch.
You do.
It also speaks to the profound nature of the divine commitment to clarity.
Indeed. And it forces us to reflect on the spiritual weight of this, the purity of the source. For the law to be perfectly just, it must be perfectly intact. We see this reinforced in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 6, verse 19. It speaks about the singular purpose of the revelation. It commands the prophet to say, "And this Quran was revealed to me that I may warn you thereby, and whomever it reaches. Say, he is but one God, and indeed I am free of what you associate with him."
So the mechanism of warning is the Quran itself.
The mechanism is the book.
The book is the source of guidance and warning, not the human being delivering it.
Exactly. This places the ultimate responsibility of guidance directly on the divine word. The act of warning, the act of guidance, it's achieved by means of the Quran.
Right.
And by limiting the messenger's role to conveyance and warning by the book, the text frees the human exemplar from the burden of creating parallel law. It protects the faith's integrity from being subject to cultural changes or historical circumstance, or just simple human error in memory.
And the end of that verse connects it all back to the core belief.
It does. The declaration of God's oneness and the dissociation from shirk associating partners with God are direct consequences of the Quran's teaching. It shows that the core doctrine itself is rooted in the book.
This sets up the concept of integrated obedience perfectly. If his role is only to convey the message, then obedience to him must be obedience to that message.
There's no other logical path.
So we have to frame the messenger's life not as an independent lawgiver, but as a practical illustration of the revealed law.
Think of it this way. His entire life, his governance, his ethics, his method of settling disputes, his business dealings, it was a continuous demonstration of the Quran being implemented perfectly within a human context.
The theory put into practice.
Perfect practice. His conduct did not stand apart as some separate parallel source of law. It was the living embodiment of the principles contained in the revelation. It's impossible to obey the principles without seeing them applied, and it's impossible to see them applied without obeying the principles.
And that's the single integrated mandate.
That's it. The authority is singular, but the mandate requires both the text, which is a law, and the implementation, which is the messenger.
Okay, so if that's the job description, conveyance, and perfect application, let's see how the divine architecture supports it. We have to turn now to the legal cornerstone, the ultimate governance framework, which is codified in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 59. This verse is the pivot upon which this entire concept of unified allegiance really rests.
It's arguably the most referenced verse whenever anyone discusses legal authority in Islam. Let's just quote the central command. "O you who have believed, obey Allah and obey the messenger and those in authority among you. And if you disagree over anything, refer it to Allah and the messenger."
What's fascinating here is the flow. It commands three distinct acts of obedience, right? But the first two are conceptually unified in this framework we're building.
That's the key insight.
So obedience to Allah means strict adherence to the fundamental, unchanging law in the Quran. And obedience to the messenger requires emulation of his practical application, the observable, living example of that same law.
And notice the use of the verb obey. It's repeated before Allah and the messenger. This signals the importance, but, and this is what the sources argue, this repetition doesn't imply dual legislation.
What does it imply?
It implies a dual manifestation of a singular will. Obedience to the messenger is mandated precisely because his obedience to Allah was absolute and flawless.
I see.
His application provides the necessary human scale model for understanding the abstract principles in the revelation. If we separate the two, we risk obeying the application without understanding the principle, or, vice versa.
And then the verse concludes with this powerful, almost philosophical statement of result. It says, that is the best way and best in result. This isn't just a command for compliance, is it? It's a guaranteed pathway to societal and spiritual stability.
And this is where we have to pause and just reflect profoundly. Why is this method superior? Why is it best in result?
What does that mean?
It means that it anchors all legal and ethical resolution in a singular, verifiable, divine source. By demanding adherence to the written word and its perfect contemporary application, the community avoids reliance on human conjecture, or arbitrary interpretations, or the political instability that's just inherent in trying to elevate fallible human records to an independent divine status.
So it makes justice verifiable.
Verifiable, transparent, and anchored in an authority beyond any human dispute.
Now, before giving us that roadmap in 4.59, the Quran issues a really serious warning. And to fully grasp the weight of this verse, we have to look at the verses surrounding it. The context from 4.36 to 4.58 systematically lists the exact moral and legal mistakes the community should avoid. It's like it's setting the stage for 4.59 as the necessary structural remedy.
The textual context is absolutely crucial because these warnings, when you read them today, they're almost prophetic. They describe the very errors that would creep into the faith centuries later.
It's a preemptive strike.
It is. The divine system, the Sharia, is established here as the ultimate legal and ethical framework by first tearing down all the false alternatives.
And we first see this clear rejection of man-made authority and human greed in verse 4.44. It warns against those who were given a portion of the scripture, but they purchased error for petty gains. And it specifically notes that they fell for man-made books.
This is an immediate and a negative precedent for elevating any human-authored text to the level of divine guidance. If the message of the Quran is complete and preserved, as 5.99 asserted, then seeking or elevating secondary books.
Any other books.
Any books authored and compiled by humans, no matter how revered they are, to a legislative authority is condemned as purchasing error. And this warning comes right before the legal instruction, preparing the minds of the believers to accept only the singular, verified source.
The warning then gets even deeper, more specific in 4.51. This verse condemns those who, even after receiving the book, still believe in JIBT and Taghut. Now, these aren't just cultural errors, they are major theological deviations.
They are. And they're critical legal and theological definitions that we really need to understand in plain language. Let's start with JIBT.
Okay.
Think of JIBT as the false idols of superstition, occult sciences, baseless mysteries. Really, anything that relies on unverifiable claims rather than clear, rational evidence. It is the realm of mystics and soothsayers who try to bypass rational law with secrets.
And Taghut.
Taghut is the personification of evil authority. It specifically refers to evil humans who try to play God. Religious leaders, priests, mullahs, or political figures who claim or are believed to possess divine powers or infallible religious knowledge.
So the demagogues.
The demagogues who exploit people, demanding an unquestioning allegiance that belongs only to the divine.
So when 4.59 provides the true singular structure for authority, obey God, the Quran, and the messenger, the Quran's implementer, it does so immediately following verses that condemn following precisely the kind of non-divine, human-created legislative material.
That relies on superstition.
Unverifiable claims.
And elevated human authority, yes.
The implication for our thesis is, well, it's stark.
It is. The Quran is warning against the very human tendency to turn to unverified sources and religious figures who claim an infallible knowledge parallel to the divine text.
Right.
So introducing an external corpus, a vast collection of hearsay accounts compiled centuries later, it carries the inherent documented risk of importing JIBT and elevating individuals or historical figures to the level of Taghut. It replaces clear divine text with subjective human authority.
And this condemnation culminates in the concept of shirk, which our source material defines not just as associating idols, but as a tremendous drag on one's own person. That's the term ithm. We find this in 4.48. God does not forgive that divinity be ascribed to other than him, but he may forgive anything else to whom he wills.
We have to clarify the connection here. It's so important. When we talk about shirk in this legislative context, we aren't primarily talking about idols of wood and stone. We're talking about hakimiyya sovereignty in the realm of law. If God alone is the sovereign, then he alone is the legislator. To introduce a second, non-divine source of law and give it equal or even secondary status is seen as committing shirk in the realm of sovereignty.
It's claiming God has a partner.
A partner in ruling and legislating, yes.
And that's the drag on the self, the ithm.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The term ithm conveys this sense of a burden, of a violation that drags the human self down. By diluting the absolute authority of the divine legislator, one compromises the integrity of their own soul and their own ethical compass. The integrity of the faith relies on maintaining the singularity of that legislative source. Any deviation is a direct assault on the fundamental principle of divine oneness.
Okay, so if the community must maintain the singularity of divine law, how does the command in 4.59 instruct us to resolve disputes? It says, refer it to Allah and the messenger.
And this is the rational test of the entire framework. The required reference point for all legal and practical disputes, it must be singular, clear, and universally verifiable.
Right, so if a dispute arises today, what is Allah's reference?
It's the Quran, preserved and intact.
And what is the messenger's reference?
His only legal reference was the Quran itself, as confirmed elsewhere in this very same surah.
We see that connection specifically in 4.105, which commands the prophet. We have revealed to you the book in truth, that you may judge between people by means of what God has shown you.
The instruction is definitive, by means of what God has shown you. The messenger's function is strictly as the executor of the Quran, not a co-legislator providing a second parallel law.
So to suggest that refer it to Allah and the messenger means referring disputes to a vast, humanly collected, and historically unverifiable corpus.
Implies that the ultimate legal standard is opaque and potentially corrupted, and that contradicts the requirement for clarity, for equity, for competence demanded throughout the entire text. The only clear reference point for the messenger is the book he was conveying.
The non-dualistic nature of the command is then sealed in 4.80. He who obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah.
There it is.
But those who turn away, we have not sent you over them as a guardian.
Think of it like a presidential spokesperson or a high court judge. The judge's ruling carries absolute authority only when it is based precisely on the established written law.
Right.
If the judge starts adding their own opinions or legislating from personal experience, their authority instantly vanishes.
They're no longer a judge.
They're no longer a judge. The messenger's obedience is exactly that, a flawless delivery and application system for the divine law. Obedience to the prophet is obedience to God, precisely because the prophet never ever legislates outside of the divine revelation. The commands are unified because the legislative authority is singular.
That distinction law versus application, that's the whole game. The messenger provides the perfect applied model, but the law itself remains solely with Allah, preserved in the Quran. Theory is one thing, but how does this unified, Quran-centric mandate work on the ground? Let's move from the legal theory to a concrete case study that every community faces, a failure in a contract, and see how the messenger, stripped of external, independent legislative authority, would handle it.
This is an excellent way to make the concept tangible. So let's introduce our hypothetical scenario. You have Zaid, who lent a substantial sum of money to Amr.
Okay.
And being neighbors, good friends, they conducted the loan without any written agreement, no witnesses, no formal documentation, just a handshake.
A common mistake.
A very common mistake. Now, Amr refuses repayment and denies the debt ever existed. So Zaid appeals to the messenger for justice.
So traditionally, one might expect the messenger to offer some kind of independent ruling, maybe based on his personal wisdom or some oath-taking procedure, something like that.
Right.
But if he is strictly the executor of the Quran, what happens?
The messenger, as the living embodiment of the book, would not offer an independent, extra-Quranic ruling to fill the gap of human negligence. It's not his job.
So what would he do?
His directive would be rooted entirely in the source. It would be a lesson about the source's sufficiency for future conduct and a profound lesson for the current situation. He would have to regretfully inform Zaid that in the absence of evidence required by the divine standard, he cannot enforce repayment.
That's harsh.
It is, but he would immediately follow up with a corrective instruction, the lesson.
And the Quran contains incredibly detailed, rational guidance on financial dealings. Famously in Surah Al-Baqarah 2.282, which is the longest verse in the entire book. And it's dedicated precisely to this issue.
And the wisdom embedded in this detailed guidance is just. It's profound. The verse is a foundational text for establishing rational, verifiable, and equitable commerce. It provides meticulous instructions. O you who have believed, when you contract a debt for a fixed term, write it down.
It starts with writing.
Writing. The instructions continue. You must use a scribe and write in justice. The one with the obligation must dictate, and crucially, there must be witnesses.
The witnesses are key.
Key. 2 men, or 1 man and 2 women, and the text explains why. So that if one of them errs, then the other can remind her.
The law here isn't based on mystic insight or unrecorded tradition. It's based on meticulous, rational evidence.
Absolutely. And the reflective insight provided within the verse itself is stunning. The text explicitly states why these measures are required, which moves the law away from arbitrary command and into the realm of wisdom.
What reason does it give?
It says, That is more just in the sight of Allah and stronger as evidence and more likely to prevent doubt between you. This shows the profound emphasis on verifiable, rational processes. It prioritizes clarity and the prevention of disputes over simple human goodwill or unverifiable oral agreements. God's law demands evidence because evidence is the foundation of justice.
So in our case study, the messenger's response to Zayd wouldn't be a novel, independent ruling attempting to magically create evidence where none exists.
Not at all.
He would explain the necessity and the wisdom of the Quran's clear guidance for transactions laid out in 2.282.
He would essentially be fulfilling his duty under 5.99 to deliver the message, which in this case is the law requiring documentation and witnesses. He would express regret for Zayd's current predicament due to neglecting the Quranic instructions, but his role is not to fill gaps in human negligence with new, unrevealed law.
Right.
His role is to remind believers that the guidance is already complete and sufficient. The consequence of the failed transaction serves as a practical, even painful lesson in the necessity of adhering to the divine instruction.
This brings us to a highly analytical observation made in our sources. It's about the traditional narrative structure of later compilations. While the Hadith literature records many rulings attributed to the Prophet, it is conspicuously rare for him to explicitly cite a specific Quranic verse like 2.282 to advise parties on how they should have conducted their affairs according to the book.
And this structural silence is critical. It's a huge point. If the Prophet's role was purely conveyance and application, then every single dispute resolution should have been prefaced with or concluded by a clear citation of the governing Quranic verse.
You would expect him to say, the Quran says in this verse, therefore.
Exactly. But the typical Hadith structure often presents the Prophet's ruling simply as his authoritative statement, his Sunnah, rather than explicitly showcasing him applying the Quran's self-sufficient instructions by quoting specific verses.
I see the implication. So the way those narratives were written later on, and then compiled and accepted as an independent source of law, that's what created the legal tension we see today.
Yes.
The later narrators focused on the result, the Prophet's ruling, without preserving the explicit source, the Quranic verse he used to arrive at that ruling.
Precisely. This structural silence reinforces the idea that later jurisprudence, which sought to establish the Prophet's rulings as independent law-giving, stands in logical conflict with his core duty from 5.99 and the sufficiency of the Quran.
So if the Prophet was sitting in that dispute with Zayd and Amr, he wouldn't say, my independent judgment is X.
No. He would say the Quran, in Surah 2, verse 282, tells you exactly what steps you should have taken to prevent this injustice. The law is the book. The messenger is the demonstrator.
So the key takeaway from the case study is that the purpose of obedience to the messenger is to learn how to perfectly obey the book. It's a mechanism for learning application, not a parallel legislative track.
It is the only way to reconcile the explicit command of the Quran being complete and the messenger's role being only to convey it. The very fact that the Quran contains its longest verse, specifically dedicated to preventing financial disputes, demonstrates its profound detailed sufficiency for societal governance. There is no detail that requires an independent, unrevealed law to fill a gap.
Okay, so if we accept this premise, that the Quran is the sole self-sufficient legislative force and that external unverified traditions are excluded, then how does the community govern itself? This can sound, well, it can sound overwhelming, but the source material is clear. The community must use its God-given intellect, its aql, to implement principles. And this introduces the concept of ijtihad, independent reasoning.
And this is a crucial pivot. It demands intellectual honesty. The Quran doesn't just reject false sources. It mandates genuine, rational engagement with the divine text. It rejects intellectual passivity.
It's not about blind following.
Not at all. If all authority flows from the Quran, then human intellect is the tool God has given us to derive and apply those principles accurately to new situations. Ijtihad is not legislating new law. It is the critical thinking applied to divine text to find the most faithful and just application.
Our sources lay out a logical, 5-step mechanism for dispute resolution anchored solely in revelation. It completely replaces reliance on unverifiable tradition with a verifiable, rational process. This is the toolkit for modern revelation.
And this mechanism ensures rigor. It removes subjectivity. So let's break it down as a framework for ijtihad.
Okay, step 1 is textual priority.
Always start with the source. You seek direct, explicit guidance in the Quran itself. This is the most direct and purest form of reference. If the Quran speaks explicitly on a matter like the documentation of debt, That is the final word. No need to go further.
Step 2 is the Quranic exemplar.
Since we've established the messenger's life was the perfect application of the Quran, we look for his application, but, and this is key, only as recorded and authenticated within the Quranic narratives themselves.
So you stay within the one book.
You stay within the one book. This includes the legal and ethical lessons derived from the divinely authenticated accounts of his conduct, which are preserved in the text itself. This ensures the exemplar is referenced through the same singular source.
Step 3 is principle extraction. This moves from the explicit application to the universal values.
Correct. The Quran provides broad universal values, justice, or adl, balance, compassion, rafan, equity. We must identify these universal principles embedded in the text and the messenger's Quranic example. Well, the detailed rules about witnesses in 2.282 aren't just about witnesses. They are about the underlying principle of certainty and accountability in all dealings.
Then comes the application phase, step 4. Analogical reasoning, qiyas.
This is applying that extracted principle to a new or unprecedented context by drawing clear, logical parallels. If the Quran demands witnesses for a simple loan, the principle of certainty applies equally to a complex, modern financial derivative.
The context is new, but the principle is ancient.
Ancient and divine. And this must be done with complete fidelity to the original Quranic intent, avoiding arbitrary personal preference.
And finally, step 5, which ensures the holistic integrity of the ruling. Objectives of Sharia, Maqayid al-Sharia.
This is the ultimate check. The solution must ensure it upholds the Quran's universal goals: the preservation of life, the preservation of intellect, the preservation of faith, the din, of lineage, and of property. If an application of a principle violates any of these primary objectives, the ijtihad is flawed. It must be reevaluated against the text.
So this mechanism ensures that every ruling flows from the revelation, and that human reason is used to apply divine law, not to circumvent it.
Precisely.
The spiritual importance of this rational, intellectual engagement, it can't be overstated. It's really about seeking wisdom.
And the Quran speaks directly to this. Surah Al-Baqarah 2.269 states, "He gives wisdom, hikmah, to whom he wills, and whoever has been given wisdom has certainly been given much good, and none will remember except those of understanding."
So wisdom is a gift.
It's defined as the divine gift necessary for sound interpretation and application of the law, but it's a gift achieved through sincere intellectual effort, through study and critical engagement with the text. It is a reward for using the intellect God gave us.
Without that deep intellectual engagement, merely possessing the physical text is meaningless. Which leads us to that striking analogy in Surah Al-Jumu'ah 62.5.
The donkey analogy.
The example of those who were entrusted with the Torah and then did not take it on is like that of a donkey who carries volumes of books. Wretched is the example of the people who deny the signs of Allah.
I mean, that is a scathing, powerful critique of intellectual passivity. The analogy warns against carrying the burden of Scripture, the physical weight and presence of the books, without truly understanding or acting upon its teachings.
It's a heavy image.
It's so visceral. If one prioritizes later human compilations or relies on passive transmission rather than direct rational engagement with the message of the Quran, one risks becoming like the donkey, carrying the weight without gaining the benefit of the wisdom within. It is a warning against treating divine text as mere ritualistic baggage rather than as a living applied guide.
Let's directly address the term at the heart of the alternative jurisprudence, hadith. The source material notes that the Quran uses the word hadith in its plain Arabic sense, as a narration, an account, or a story, not as the technical term for the later compilations that developed centuries after the Prophet's death.
Yeah, this is a crucial linguistic distinction. When the Quran refers to hadith, it's referring to speech or narrative in general, whether it's divine or human. It does not designate a separate, inspired body of prophetic traditions as an independent source of law.
Right.
And the critical, rhetorical question posed by the revelation is found in Surah Al-Araf 7.185, which asserts the sufficiency of the book. In what hadith after this Quran are they going to believe then?
That rhetorical challenge asserts the Quran's finality and sufficiency. If this book is the complete, final divine narration, then what subsequent human narration, what subsequent hadith is needed or authorized for legislative guidance?
The Quran itself is the ultimate and sufficient hadith. To seek legislative guidance elsewhere is to imply that the ultimate authority has somehow failed to communicate fully. And this undermines the completeness assertion we started with in 5.99.
So the later collection and systematization of the prophet's sayings and actions, the technical Hadith corpus, that was a scholarly development by the community to preserve history.
Yes, a historical project.
But from this Quran-centric viewpoint, these compilations possess no independent authority from Allah as a source of law because they are not explicitly commanded or referenced by the Quran. So to rely on them as a second source of law is therefore seen as ignoring the explicit condemnation of man-made books and seeking a secondary hadith after the sufficient one has already been revealed. The entire integrity of the faith rests on this singularity of the source.
And as we conclude this deep dive, we return to the profound purpose of that unified mandate. The command to obey Allah and obey the Messenger, it is a single, inseparable pledge. And it's designed, fundamentally, to guard the purity of the faith against human innovation, or Bidah. This unity ensures clarity and stability.
So the messenger's authority is entirely derived. His commands carry divine weight only because they faithfully mirror Allah's words. It ensures that the believer is obeying the law, which is Allah, through adherence to its perfect, living application, which is the messenger.
And we circle back to the sternest of warnings. It's found in Surah An-Nisa 16.116. This verse just summarizes the legislative peril we've been discussing. It says, "And do not say of what your tongues assert, this is lawful and this is unlawful, to fabricate lies against Allah. Indeed, those who invent falsehood about Allah will not succeed."
Wow.
Fabricating religious rulings, declaring something mandatory or forbidden without explicit divine authorization, is precisely what the Quran-centric view argues later. Unverified traditions can enable when they are elevated to legislative status.
So the logical conclusion drawn from our sources is this: to grant any person or any external source the authority to add to Allah's din, his way of life, is to commit shirk in the realm of sovereignty, hakimiyya. This is the fundamental deviation that compromises one's allegiance away from the sole sovereign. The Prophet's example was one of absolute strict adherence to the Quran, and our obedience to him is therefore obedience to the perfect application of the message he was commanded to convey.
Just as one obeys a rigorously established legal system through adherence to its verifiable statutes as applied by the court, believers obey Allah through the verifiable guidance of the Quran as conveyed by the messenger. By engaging the divine text directly and applying its principles using reason or ijtihad, as was the constant example of the Prophet, believers contribute to a transparent, just, and righteous society. They secure the best end result promised in 4.59.
And this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our listener. If the messenger's example was one of absolute, strict, and verifiable adherence to the Quran alone, what intellectual and spiritual responsibility does that place on the contemporary believer to engage the divine text directly? How does the obligation to strip away centuries of inherited, unverified material relying only on reason and verifiable text radically change our understanding of what a truly just and righteous society anchored in pure divine law should look like today? That is the journey of reflection we invite you to continue.